This happened last October during a backpacking trip in the Mount Baker Wilderness in Washington state. I'm an avid hiker, and I've done plenty of multi-day trips before, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on that mountain. There were 3 of us on the trip: me, Emma, my boyfriend Eli, and our friend Sam. We'd been planning this particular route for months. We aimed to do a 4-day loop, hitting some of the most scenic spots in the area. The weather forecast looked decent for that time of year, so we figured we'd get one last adventure in before the snow hit. The first 2 days were incredible. The weather was perfect, crisp fall air, stunning autumn colors in the alpine meadows, and unreal views of Mount Baker looming above us. We made good time and were feeling great. Things started to get weird on the 3rd day. We woke up to a thick blanket of fog that had settled over our campsite during the night. It was so dense we could barely see 20 feet in front of us. We debated waiting it out, but the forecast had said it would be clear. So we figured it would burn off as the day went on. Big mistake. As we hiked that morning, the fog only seemed to get thicker. The temperature dropped, and an eerie silence fell over the forest. There were no bird calls, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the sound of our own labored breathing as we climbed higher up the mountain. Around midday, we realized we must have gotten off the trail at some point. Nothing looked familiar, and our GPS was going haywire, probably due to the heavy cloud cover. We decided to backtrack to try to find where we'd gone wrong. That's when we started hearing it. At first, it was so faint, I thought I was just imagining things. It was a low rumbling sound, almost like distant thunder, but there was a rhythmic quality to it, almost like breathing. I pointed it out to Eli and Sam, and they heard it too. Probably just the wind, Eli said, but he didn't sound convinced. We picked up our pace, eager to get back on the trail and to a more open area. The sound got louder and closer. It was definitely moving, and it was definitely following us. Suddenly, Sam stopped short. "Did you see that?" he whispered, pointing off into the mist. I squinted, trying to see what he was looking at. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something massive moving through the trees, about 50 yards away. It was hard to make out details in the fog, but the silhouette was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was vaguely humanoid, but huge, at least 9 or 10 feet tall. The way it moved was all wrong, too fluid and quick for its size. "We need to get out of here now." Eli's voice was tight with fear. We started running, no longer caring about finding the trail. We were just desperate to put distance between us and whatever that thing was. The sound of its breathing got louder, punctuated now by the crack of breaking branches as it crashed through the forest after us. I risked a glance over my shoulder. I wish I hadn't. It was closer now, and I could make out more details. Matted fur covered its enormous body. Its arms were impossibly long, knuckles practically dragging on the ground. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for months to come. A wide, lipless mouth filled with jagged teeth, and the eyes, glowing an unnatural yellow-green in the gloom, filled with a terrible intelligence it shouldn't have possessed. I let out an involuntary scream. The thing roared in response, a sound so loud and inhuman that it made my bones vibrate. We ran for what felt like hours, stumbling over roots and rocks, lungs burning, fueled by pure adrenaline and terror. Eventually, we burst out of the tree line into a small clearing. The fog was thinner here, and we could see a steep rock face about 100 yards ahead. There, Sam pointed to a narrow crevice in the cliff face. We might be able to squeeze in there. It was our only chance. We sprinted for the opening, the creature's thunderous footsteps and rasping breath getting closer by the second. Eli reached the crevice first and helped pull Sam and me inside. It was a tight fit, but we managed to wedge ourselves several feet back into the narrow space. Not a moment too soon, a massive, hairy arm shot into the opening, clawed hand grasping wildly, trying to reach us. The stench that rolled off the creature was overwhelming, like rotting meat, wet dog, and something alien I couldn't even describe. Its roars of frustration were deafening in the confined space. We pressed ourselves as far back as we could, hardly daring to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, the arm withdrew. We heard snuffing sounds as it apparently tried to catch our scent. Then silence. Minutes ticked by. We stayed frozen in place, straining to hear any sign of the creature. Finally, Eli whispered, "I think it's gone." Slowly, cautiously, we edged our way back to the entrance of the crevice. The clearing was empty, no sign of the monster. The fog was starting to lift, too, though the light was fading. It would be dark soon. We briefly debated trying to make it back to our campsite, but quickly decided it was way too risky. We had no idea where we were or which direction the thing had gone. Our best bet was to spend the night in the relative safety of the rock crevice and try to find our way out in the morning. It was a miserable, sleepless night. We huddled together for warmth, jumping at every little sound, convinced the creature would return at any moment. But somehow we made it to dawn. In the light of day, with the fog completely gone now, we were able to get our bearings. We were several miles off course but alive. We hightailed it out of there as fast as we could, not even stopping to try to retrieve our tent and other gear from the previous campsite. It took most of the day, but we finally made it back to the trailhead where we'd left our car. We drove straight home in shocked silence, each lost in our own thoughts. In the weeks that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened to us. Bigfoot was the closest thing we could come up with, but this had seemed far more aggressive and predatory than any Sasquatch stories I'd ever heard. We thought about reporting it to the authorities, but decided against it. I mean, who would believe us? We'd sound crazy. And some weird part of me thought that if we told anyone, at least any authorities, it might somehow draw the creature to us again. So we've kept it to ourselves until now. I guess Eli and Sam don't like to talk about it. I think they're trying to convince themselves it was just a bear or the fog played tricks on our eyes. I don't know how they explain the arm reaching into the crevice, but that's for them to decide. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard, what I smelled. It was real, and it was not of this world. I know this all probably sounds completely unbelievable. If I hadn't lived through it, I wouldn't believe it either. But I swear on everything I hold dear that this is what happened to us on Mount Baker. So, I guess this is partly a warning. If you're hiking in the Pacific Northwest and the fog rolls in too thick, get out of there. Don't assume it's just weather. It might be hiding something far worse. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe the channel for future videos, and like and share with your friends. I never believed in ghosts. I always thought those stories were just, stories. But some things have been happening in my house recently that are making me wonder. It all started about 3 months ago. I have a daughter, Lily, who just turned 3, or at least she had at the time. She's always been a pretty clever kid, quick to pick up new words and concepts. But lately, she's been talking about things that make no sense. "Daddy, can I go play with Eliza?" she asked one morning over breakfast. I looked up from my coffee. "Who's Eliza, sweetie?" "My friend who lives in the attic," Lily replied matter-of-factly. She just shoveled another spoonful of cereal into her mouth, like nothing was any different than any other day. I chuckled. "Honey, we don't have an attic. You must mean one of your dolls." Lily shook her head emphatically. "No, Daddy. Eliza lives upstairs. She's lonely." I shared a look with my wife, Megan, across the table. She shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. Kids and their imagination, right? We didn't think much of it at first. Lily would mention Eliza now and then, but we figured it was just a phase. Lots of kids have imaginary friends. But as the weeks went by, things started to get weird. One night, I woke up to the sound of Lily's voice. It was coming from her room right next to ours. I got up, thinking she must have had a nightmare or something. As I approached her door, I could hear her talking. "It's okay, Eliza. Don't be scared. They're nice, I promise." I pushed the door open slowly. Lily was sitting up in bed, facing the corner of the room. She turned to look at me, a bright smile on her face. "Daddy, Eliza was worried about meeting you, but I told her it's okay." I felt a chill run down my spine. The room was empty except for Lily and me. But the way she looked at that corner, it was like she really saw someone there. "Sweetie, it's late. You should be sleeping," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But Daddy, Eliza wants to play. She says she's been alone for so long." I walked over to Lily's bed, scooped her up in my arms, and said, "How about we get you some water, and then it's back to bed? Okay?" As I carried her out of the room, I could have sworn I felt something. A presence, like we weren't alone. I shook it off, blaming it on lack of sleep and everything that had been going on. The next day, though, I decided to do some research on the house, just out of curiosity. We'd only moved in about 6 months prior, and I realized I didn't know much about its history. I spent my lunch break at work digging through online records and old newspaper archives, and what I found made my blood run cold. In 1932, a family lived in our house, the Caldwells. They had a daughter named Elizabeth, Eliza for short. She was 3 years old when she disappeared. The parents claimed she must have wandered off, but the police suspected foul play. They searched the house and the surrounding area, but Eliza was never found. I sat back in my chair. It had to be a coincidence, right? Lily must have heard the name Eliza somewhere and made up this whole story. But how would she know about an attic that doesn't exist? When I got home that evening, Lily was playing in the living room. Megan was in the kitchen preparing dinner. I kissed her hello and then sat down next to Lily on the floor. "Hi, sweetie. What are you playing?" Lily looked up from her blocks, beaming. "I'm building a house for Eliza. She says she likes it here, but sometimes she misses her old house." I swallowed hard. "Lily, can you tell me more about Eliza? What does she look like?" Lily thought for a moment. "Well, she has yellow hair, a blue dress, flowers on it, but sometimes she looks sad. She says she wants to go home, but can't find her mommy and daddy." I tried to keep my voice calm. "And where does Eliza live?" "In the attic, silly. I told you before." I nodded, standing up. "Right, of course you did. I'm gonna go help mommy with dinner." "Okay." As I walked to the kitchen, my mind was racing. This couldn't be real. There had to be a logical explanation. Over the next few weeks, things started to escalate. Objects would move when nobody was looking. We would hear footsteps upstairs, even though both Lily and Megan were downstairs with me. One morning, we woke up to find all of Lily's toys arranged in a perfect circle in the middle of her room. "Eliza did it!" Lily exclaimed, clapping her hands in delight. She said it's a game. Megan and I were at our wits' end. We'd had Lily evaluated by a child psychologist, who found nothing unusual. We'd had the house checked for gas leaks, thinking maybe we were all hallucinating. But nothing. Finally, desperate for answers, we called a medium. I know, it sounds crazy, but we were really out of options. The medium, a woman named Clarissa, arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. As soon as she stepped into the house, her face went pale. "There's so much energy here," she whispered, her eyes darting around the room. "So much sadness and fear." Lily, who had been playing quietly in the corner, suddenly perked up. "Are you here to help Eliza?" Clarissa knelt down next to Lily, her voice gentle. "Can you tell me about Eliza, sweetheart?" As Lily babbled away, describing her friend in detail, at least 3-year-old detail, Clarissa's expression grew more and more troubled. Finally, she stood up and turned to us. "Your daughter is gifted," she said quietly. "She can see things that most of us can't. And what she's seeing, it's real." Megan gripped my hand tightly. "What do you mean, real?" Clarissa took a deep breath. "There's a spirit here, a little girl. She's been trapped in this house for a very long time, unable to move on. She's lonely and scared, and she's latched onto your daughter because they're the same age." Felt like the room was spinning. This couldn't be happening. Ghosts weren't real. They couldn't be. But then Lily spoke up, her voice small and worried. "Eliza's crying. She says she wants mommy and daddy. Can you help her find them?" Clarissa nodded solemnly. "We're gonna try, sweetie. Can you show us where Eliza is right now?" Lily pointed to the ceiling. "In the attic. She's always in the attic." We all looked up. There was no attic access that we knew of, just a normal ceiling. But Clarissa seemed to understand something that we didn't. "The attic was sealed off," she murmured. "Probably after what happened." She turned to us, her eyes serious. "We need to open it up. It's the only way to help Eliza move on." The next few hours were a blur. We called a contractor, who confirmed that there was indeed a sealed-off space above our second floor, one that neither my wife nor I knew about. As they worked to create an access point, Clarissa prepared for what she called a crossing over ceremony. Finally, as the sun was setting, we stood at the base of a newly installed pull-down ladder. Clarissa went up first, followed by Megan and me. Lily insisted on coming too, despite our reservations. But I figured I'd rather have her with me than have her wandering around the house downstairs while whatever was going on up here. So I scooped her up and brought her up with us. The attic was small and dusty, filled with cobwebs and forgotten relics of the past. As our eyes adjusted to the gloom, we all gasped in unison. There, in the far corner, was a child-sized skeleton, wearing the tattered remains of a blue dress with faded flowers. Lily broke free from my grasp and ran toward the corner. "Eliza, it's okay. Don't be scared. These people are here to help you." I couldn't see anything, but the air in that corner seemed to shimmer, like heat rising from pavement on a hot day. I went and got Lily and told her she couldn't go running about up here, and she nodded. Clarissa stepped forward, her voice soft and soothing. "Elizabeth Caldwell, Eliza, we're here to help you. It's time to go home, sweetheart." What happened next, I still can't fully explain. The air in the attic seemed to change, becoming lighter somehow. A soft breeze blew through the room, even though there were no windows. Lily giggled. "Eliza says thank you. She's not scared anymore." And then, just like that, it was over. The oppressive feeling that had filled our house for months lifted. Lily looked around, confused. "Where did Eliza go?" Clarissa smiled gently. "She went home, sweetie, to her real home." In the days that followed, we worked with the police to properly investigate and lay Eliza's remains to rest. It turned out her father had hidden her body in the attic after accidentally killing her in a drunken rage. He sealed off the attic and told everyone she wandered away. The truth had died with him and his wife years ago. It's been a few months since that night in the attic. Our house feels different now, peaceful. Lily doesn't talk about Eliza anymore, although sometimes I catch her smiling at empty corners, like she's sharing a secret with an unseen friend. I don't know what to believe anymore, really. I've always been a skeptic, a rational thinker. But after what happened in our house, it's hard to explain it all. I know one thing, though. A little girl who had been lost for almost a century is finally at rest. And for that, I'm grateful. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to cryptids. I mean, who wouldn't be? But a few weeks ago, something happened that forced me to change my perspective. I still can't really explain it, and to be honest, I'm just trying to process it all. It all started with a camping trip I had planned with a couple of friends. We chose a remote spot by a small lake in the woods, a place that not many people go to. We set up our tents, made a campfire, and spent the evening sharing stories and roasting marshmallows, camp stuff. Around midnight, after we'd all settled into our tents, I heard a rustling noise outside. I tried to ignore it, but the noise got closer and closer, almost like something was moving around the campsite. I peeked out of my tent and saw nothing but darkness and trees. I figured it was probably a deer or some other animal. The noises continued, though, and I really started to feel uneasy. My friends were fast asleep, so I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out, trying to ignore the chill that ran down my spine. The moonlight was barely piercing the canopy overhead, and the forest was eerily quiet. Something just wasn't right. I walked toward the lake, where the rustling seemed to originate from. As I got to the water's edge, I noticed something odd, an unusual shape moving in the shadows. I turned on my flashlight, and what I saw, I'll never forget. There, crouched on all fours by the lake, was what I can really only describe as a lizard-like creature. It was about 6 feet tall, covered in dark green scales that shimmered under the flashlight's beam. Its eyes were bright yellow and seemed to glow in the dark. It had long, clawed fingers and a head that resembled a reptile's, with a snout and sharp, pointed teeth. I just froze, my mind fumbling to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature didn't seem to notice me at first, but when it finally did look up, its gaze met mine. I felt a jolt of fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. In that moment, I think I finally understood the true meaning of the term primal fear. The creature let out a growl and slowly stood up on two legs. It was then that I noticed its whole body was covered in a weird bioluminescent pattern that pulsed with each breath it took. I finally managed to turn and sprint back to the campsite. I thought my heart was going to pound out of my chest. I burst into the tent and woke up all my friends. But by the time they came outside, the creature was gone. We searched the area but never found any trace of it. Not even a footprint. My friends are skeptical and I can't say I blame them. But I know what I saw. The rest of the trip was a blur, and we packed up and left the next morning. I haven't been back to that lake since, and I'm not sure I'll ever go back. I've read about the lizard man of Scape or Swamp, and the descriptions are strikingly similar to what I saw. So, call me crazy if you want, but I swear on everything I hold dear that I saw something out there that night. It's been weeks, and I'm still trying to come to terms with it. Maybe I never will, but I'll never forget the look in those glowing yellow eyes. I've been an avid hiker for years. Solo trips are my thing. I love the solitude, the challenge, the connection with nature. I've tackled some of the toughest trails in the country. But what happened last weekend on a supposedly easy day hike shook me to my core. It was supposed to be a simple 6-hour loop in the Chattahoochee National Forest. I'd done it before, no big deal. I packed light, just water, some trail mix, and my usual gear. The weather was perfect, a cool, crisp autumn day with clear skies. I hit the trail early, around 7 a.m. The first couple of hours were great. I made good time, enjoyed the fall colors, and snapped some photos for Instagram. Standard stuff. Around midday, though, things started to get weird. I stopped for lunch at a familiar overlook. At least it should have been familiar, but something just felt off. The view wasn't quite right, and the angle of the sun was wrong for the time of day. I chalked it up to misremembering and kept going. An hour later, I still hadn't reached the next landmark. My GPS wasn't getting a signal, so I pulled out my compass. That's when I saw it. The needle was spinning. Not just wobbling, but full-on spinning like a pinwheel in a strong wind. I'm not usually one to panic, but in that moment, my heart started racing. I took a deep breath and tried to orient myself. I looked for the sun and tried to remember the route, but everything looked wrong, unfamiliar. I decided to backtrack, figuring I'd retrace my steps to the last place I was sure of. But after an hour of walking, I wasn't any closer to somewhere I recognized. The trees all looked the same, and the path seemed to twist in ways I didn't remember. That's when it hit me. I'd been walking for hours, and I was completely lost. I stopped and forced myself to think logically. I had water, food, and shelter if I needed it. I wasn't in any immediate danger, but I also knew that wandering aimlessly could make my situation much worse. I tried my phone again, no signal. My GPS app showed me in the middle of nowhere, the blue dot jumping erratically across the screen. Even the fitness app that had been tracking my hike was glitching, showing impossible distances and elevations. I looked at my compass again, still spinning. I held it next to my phone, thinking maybe there was some weird electromagnetic interference. The needle slowed for a moment, almost settling, and then spun even faster. The logical part of my brain kept saying there had to be a rational explanation. A magnetic anomaly in the rocks, maybe, or my compass was broken. But another part of me, a more primal part, was screaming that something was very, very wrong. As the afternoon wore on, my unease grew. The forest seemed different, quieter. The birds had stopped singing, and even the rustle of small animals in the underbrush had gone silent. The only sound was the wind in the trees, and even that sounded strange, hollow, somehow. I picked a direction and started walking, trying to keep as straight a line as possible. I used the sun to orient myself, figuring even if I didn't hit the trail, I'd eventually reach a road or the edge of the forest. But the sun didn't move for hours. It sat in the same spot in the sky. My watch said time was passing, but everything else said it wasn't. As it got later, I started to worry about spending the night in the forest. I had a light jacket and an emergency blanket in my pack, but the temperatures would drop significantly after dark. I needed to find a way out before then. Then, I saw a flash of color through the trees. My heart leapt. Another hiker? A ranger? I moved toward it, pushing through the dense underbrush. I burst into a small clearing and froze. There, hanging from a low branch, was a jacket, my jacket, the one I was wearing. I looked down at myself, sure I was losing my mind. But no, I was still wearing my jacket. So how? I approached it slowly. It looked worn, faded, like it had been out in the elements for months. When I touched it, it crumbled to dust. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This was impossible. I felt like I was in a nightmare, but I couldn't wake up. I ran. I don't know for how long. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs couldn't do it anymore. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I realized I was back in the same clearing. The dust from the jacket was still there on the ground. As the last of the daylight faded, even though my watch insisted it was only 3 p.m., I made a decision. I was clearly no longer on the trail. I knew whatever was happening, wherever I was, normal rules didn't apply. So, I stopped trying to find my way out. Instead, I found a sheltered spot, built a small fire, and set up camp for the night. As I sat there, watching the flames, I tried not to think about the jacket that couldn't exist, the sun that didn't move, or the compass that wouldn't stop spinning. I must have dozed off at some point. When I opened my eyes, it was dawn, real dawn, with the sun that moved and birds that sang. My phone had signal, my GPS worked, and I was a half-mile from the trailhead. I got out of there fast. I hiked back to my car and drove home in a daze. I've spent the last week trying to make sense of what happened, researching time slips, dimensional shifts, all sorts of fringe theories I would have laughed at before. I don't have any answers, just a story that sounds crazy even to me and a fear of compasses I never had before. I'm writing this as a warning, I guess, to solo hikers, to anyone who goes into the wilderness alone. Sometimes you find yourself in loops you can't explain and can't escape. Sometimes the way out isn't to keep pushing forward, but to stop and let whatever has caught you let go of you. Be safe out there. And if your compass starts to spin, don't follow it. Make camp, wait it out. The normal world will return eventually. I've always been a bit of a tech enthusiast, so when the latest smartwatch hit the market, I couldn't resist. I justified the purchase by telling myself it would help me stay on top of my health and fitness goals. Little did I know, this innocent gadget would lead me down a rabbit hole of unexplainable events that would make me question everything I thought I knew about technology. It all started about 3 weeks ago. I had just finished setting up my new smartwatch, a sleek black model with all the bells and whistles. Heart rate monitor, sleep tracking, step counter, you name it, this thing had it. I synced it with my phone and spent the first few days obsessively checking my stats, marveling at how it could track my sleep patterns and nudge me when I'd been sitting too long. The novelty, though, wore off after about a week. I settled into a routine of wearing it during the day and charging it at night. That's when things started to get weird. I woke up one morning and grabbed my phone to check my notifications. As I scrolled through, I noticed an alert from my smartwatch app. Congratulations, it read. You achieved your active heart rate goal at 3:17 a.m. I frowned, tapping on the notification. The app showed a sudden spike in my heart rate, climbing from my resting rate of about 60 beats per minute to over 120 beats per minute in a matter of just a minute or two, then gradually descending back to normal over the course of an hour. That's odd, I muttered to myself. I must have forgotten to take it off before bed. I thought, maybe I had a particularly intense dream. I shrugged it off and went about my day. But the next night, I made sure to place the watch on its charger before going to sleep. I even double-checked that it was securely connected and charging properly. The following morning, I woke to find another notification. This time, my watch had recorded a sustained period of elevated heart rate between 2:45 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. Now I was puzzled. I picked up the watch and examined it closely. The charging light was still on, indicating it had been plugged in all night. I checked the app again, looking for any sign of a malfunction or error. Everything seemed to be working correctly. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Every night, without fail, my watch would record a period of intense activity while it sat on my nightstand, ostensibly charging. The times varied, but it always happened in the early morning hours, somewhere between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. I started to feel a creeping sense of unease. Now, I'm not typically one for superstition or ghost stories, but there was something deeply unsettling about this unexplained phenomenon. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was interference from other electronic devices, or perhaps the charger was faulty. I decided to conduct a little experiment. One night, I left the watch charging in the living room instead of my bedroom. To my surprise, there was no activity recorded that night. Feeling a mixture of relief and curiosity, I returned the watch to my bedroom the following evening. Sure enough, the mysterious heart rate spikes returned. By this point, I was both fascinated and slightly terrified. I started to pay more attention to my surroundings at night. Was it just my imagination? Or did the air feel different during those early morning hours? I found myself waking up randomly, heart pounding, eyes straining in the darkness for something. I'm not proud to admit it, but I became a bit obsessed. I started researching paranormal phenomena, reading accounts of ghostly encounters and unexplained events. Many of them mentioned electronic devices behaving strangely, lights flickering, radios turning on by themselves, that sort of thing. Could my smartwatch be picking up on something similar? I knew I needed more data. I set up a camera in my room, pointing it at the nightstand where I kept the watch. I also bought a cheap EMF meter, the kind ghost hunters use on those TV shows. I felt a little ridiculous, but I was determined to get to the bottom of this mystery. The first night of my investigation yielded nothing unusual on camera. The watch sat motionless on the charger, its screen occasionally lighting up to show the time. The EMF meter remained quiet, and yet, when I checked the app in the morning, there was another long period of recorded heart rate activity. This continued for several nights. I was beginning to think I was losing my mind. How could the watch be recording this activity with no visible movement? I pored over the footage, watching hours of a silent, dark room, looking for any clue. It was on the fifth night that everything changed. I had fallen into a fitful sleep, my mind still churning with questions. Suddenly, I was jolted awake by a high-pitched beeping. I sat up, disoriented, and realized it was coming from the EMF meter. My eyes darted to the nightstand. In the dim glow of the watch's screen, I could see the EMF meter's lights flashing rapidly. My heart began to race as I fumbled for my phone to start recording. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A faint, shimmering distortion in the air above the watch. It was almost like heat haze, but more purposeful. It moved in a slow, undulating pattern, sometimes expanding, sometimes contracting. I held my breath, afraid that any movement might dispel whatever I was witnessing. The EMF meter continued to beep insistently, its lights creating a frantic dance of shadows in the room. As I watched, transfixed, the distortion seemed to coalesce into a more distinct shape. It was vaguely humanoid, but constantly shifting and flowing, like smoke. I could make out what might have been a head, shoulders, arms, but they were never quite solid, never quite real. And then, incredibly, the watch began to move. It didn't slide across the surface of the nightstand. It lifted into the air, hovering a few inches above the charger. The shimmering form seemed to envelop it, and I watched in stunned disbelief as the watch's screen came to life, cycling through various displays as if someone were actively using it. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in a mix of terror and awe. Could have been minutes or hours. Eventually, the watch gently lowered back onto the charger. The shimmering form dissipated like mist in sunlight, and the EMF meter fell silent. I remained motionless for a long time after, straining my eyes and ears for any further signs of the otherworldly visitor. When at last I worked up the courage to move, I grabbed my phone with trembling hands and checked the footage I'd captured. My heart sank. The video showed nothing but a dark room, the watch sitting innocently on its charger. There was no sign of the ethereal form I'd seen, no movement of the watch. The only evidence that anything had happened at all was the EMF meter's light blinking erratically in the background. But what did that prove? I've spent the last few days trying to make sense of what I experienced. Was it a vivid dream? A hallucination brought on by lack of sleep and an overactive imagination? Or did I truly witness something beyond the realm of normal explanation? I've scoured the internet for similar experiences but found nothing quite like mine. I've considered reaching out to paranormal investigators, but I'm afraid even they'll think I'm crazy. Hell, I'm starting to think maybe I am. But every night, without fail, my watch continues to record that mysterious activity. And sometimes, in those quiet hours before dawn, I catch a glimpse of something shimmering out of the corner of my eye, gone before I can focus on it. I don't know what to do next. Part of me wants to get rid of the watch, to pretend none of this ever happened, and go back to my normal life. But a larger part of me needs to understand. What is this entity, if that's what it is? Why is it drawn to my watch? And most importantly, what does it want? I'm sharing this story in the hopes that someone out there might have experienced something similar, or at least may have some insight into what's happening. I feel like I'm standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, and I'm both terrified and exhilarated by the possibilities. For now, I'll keep watching and waiting, my EMF meter at the ready. And every night, as I lay down to sleep, I find myself whispering into the darkness. If you're there, if you're trying to communicate, I am listening. I don't know if I'll get an answer, but I do know that I'll never look at my smartwatch or even the world around me the same way again. I've always been the type to dismiss Bigfoot stories as tall tales or hoaxes, but I had an encounter a few months ago that really has me shook. I have no idea what to believe, but I swear on my life that what I saw was real, even though I can hardly believe it myself. It happened during a weekend camping trip out in the forests of northern Oregon. My friends and I were all avid hikers, and we picked this remote trail that promised to have stunning views. We weren't afraid that it was out in the middle of nowhere. We were used to that. We set up camp at a clearing beside a small creek and spent the evening around the fire, telling ghost stories and hanging out under the stars. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, after everyone had turned in for the night, I couldn't sleep. The sounds of the forest were oddly quiet, which felt strange but not alarming. I thought I'd go for a short walk to clear my head and stretch my legs. Maybe then I could sleep. I grabbed my flashlight and went down the trail, which was dimly lit by the moon. The forest was pretty quiet, and it was kind of eerie, to be honest. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots. After walking for about 20 minutes or so, I decided to stop and just enjoy the calm. That's when I heard a low, guttural growl coming from the direction of the creek. My heart skipped a beat. I've lived in the woods long enough to recognize the usual nocturnal sounds. But this was not that. This was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Curiosity got the better of me, so I followed the sound. I tried to stay as quiet as I could. I approached the creek, and that's when I noticed a large, dark figure moving among the trees. I froze in my tracks, trying to get a better look. The figure was massive, covered with what looked like dark brown fur, and it stood upright on 2 legs. My flashlight's beam caught the creature's profile. It had a broad, muscular build and a face that was vaguely humanoid but covered in hair. The eyes were deep-set and seemed to reflect the light, like a cat's eyes in the dark. Up until that night, and ever since, I haven't seen anything like it. The creature was drinking from the creek, and it seemed to sense my presence. It suddenly turned its head and locked eyes with me. Time seemed to stand still as I just stood there, rooted to the spot. The look in this thing's eyes, it was like it was curious and wary of me. After what felt like an absolute eternity, the creature let out this loud, primal scream and then bolted off into the woods. The sheer force of its movement shook the trees, and I could hear it crashing through the underbrush as it fled. I stood there for a moment, trying to wrap my head around what I had just seen. I knew I had to get back to camp, but I didn't dare move until I was sure that thing was gone. I finally hurried back to camp, my mind racing with a million thoughts and questions. When I finally got back, my friends were still asleep. I didn't want to wake them and risk sounding like I was imagining things, so I just kept it to myself until the next morning. I tried to describe what I saw, but my friends were skeptical and thought I'd just seen a bear or some other large animal. I know what it was, though. Since then, I've done a lot of research on Bigfoot and I've found that many accounts match what I saw. It's really weird to know that I might have seen something that so many people have reported but few have truly encountered. I'm still not totally sure what I saw that night. Maybe it's because I don't want to believe it myself. But I know it was something out of the ordinary. I know it's something I can't explain away with logic or reason. And you know what? I think for once I'm okay with that. I guess sometimes the woods hold secrets that we're not really meant to fully understand. And hey, what's life without a little mystery?